Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The Obioma mansion stood like a monument of glass and pride, perched high above Lagos' elite landscape. Within its marble walls and golden gates, staff members moved like silent shadows, careful not to disrupt the rhythm of their employer, Dyke Obioma, a man as feared as he was admired. At 40, Dyke commanded empires with a phone call, owned multiple conglomerates, and was preparing for the political marriage of the decade. His fiancée, Clara, daughter of Senator Ifani Namani, was the picture of high society, polished, connected, and ruthless. But despite the world at his feet, Dyke was restless, not with power, but with control. He hated anything he couldn't dominate, and Amaka, the 25-year-old maid who moved through his house like a ghost, had become his latest obsession. She was polite but firm, humble but proud. She avoided his gaze, spoke only when spoken to, and somehow made him feel unseen, something his ego couldn't tolerate. It started with soft questions about her village, followed by watching her longer than necessary as she cleaned the study. One day, he asked her to stay and help him sort his files. She kept her eyes low and obeyed. Another time, he had a headache and requested she massage his temple, the job of a personal aide, not a maid. Amaka hesitated, but obeyed again. The air grew heavier with each passing week. Dyke's touches became bolder, his glances more inappropriate. Still, Amaka tried to preserve her job with grace, bearing her discomfort in silence. That silence broke one stormy evening after Dyke returned from a boardroom dispute and a heated argument with Clara. The wine bottle emptied fast. The thunder outside matched the rage within. When Amaka brought in his dinner, he grabbed her wrist gently but firmly. "Sit," he ordered. She did nervously. What began as words of flattery soon turned manipulative. "You're not like other girls. You're kind. You understand me," he whispered, pressing his hand against her lower back. Amaka froze. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just cried in silence, not because she was weak, but because she knew resistance would lead to worse. That night, what happened wasn't loud or violent, but it was devastating. It was cloaked in manipulation and power imbalance. Dyke convinced himself it was mutual. But when she left his room, her dignity was shattered. She walked back to her servants' quarters barefoot, as if the ground had turned against her. She sat on the edge of her bed until morning, holding her knees. The pain wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Something had been stolen from her that night, and she couldn't find the words to describe it. In that moment, Amaka realized she wasn't just a maid in a mansion. She was a pawn in someone's game, a disposable shadow. But deep within her, beneath the trauma, a quiet strength had begun to stir. Amaka tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. She continued scrubbing floors, serving tea, folding Dyke suits. But inside, she was unraveling. Each time she passed him in the hallway, she felt smaller. She washed her hands compulsively, as though she could scrub away what had been done. When the nausea started a few weeks later, she knew, before the test confirmed it, she was pregnant. Her hands shook as she stared at the two faint lines. She thought about her mother in the village, her late father's warnings, and the shame that would follow. But above all, she thought of the man whose child now lived inside her, the same man who had treated her like a rag to be discarded. Still, she believed he deserved to know. Maybe he would do the right thing. Maybe. She waited until the household was quiet one evening and knocked softly on his study door. Dyke, reviewing merger documents, barely looked up. When she spoke, her voice cracked. "Sir, I'm pregnant." The room went silent. Dyke blinked once, then twice. His eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" She repeated herself. He stood up slowly, a smirk forming on his face that twisted into something darker. "Pregnant?" he laughed. "With whose child?" Amaka's lips trembled. "Yours, sir." Dyke exploded. In a voice that shook the walls, he accused her of plotting, trapping him, ruining his engagement. He hurled insults, degrading her in ways that made her shrink. Then, with no compassion and no questions asked, he ordered her out. "Leave this house." Go give that bastard to whoever belongs to, he spat. Before the staff could gather, Amaka was already outside, clutching a nylon bag with her few belongings, her slippers scraping the wet ground. She walked for hours in the dark, through rain and mud, through tears and pain. No one followed. No one asked if she was okay. When she finally found shelter in a makeshift kiosk beside an old woman's shop, she curled up on the wooden bench and cried until her voice was hoarse. The child growing inside her was now the only thing she had left. She had no home, no job, no security, but she had her baby. In that moment, something shifted. Amaka wiped her face and whispered into the darkness, "You will live. I don't know how, but you will live." That night, with mosquitoes biting and her stomach aching, Amaka made a vow to survive, not for herself, but for the innocent life Dyke had denied before it even had a name. Meanwhile, the Obioma mansion was filled with light, laughter, and music. Guests arrived in luxury vehicles with glittering attire, taking selfies beneath golden chandeliers. The newspapers called it the union of power and prestige, the wedding of Dyke Obioma and Clara. Clara was radiant in her custom-designed ivory gown, though her eyes wandered off into her phone. A text from Jide awaited her in the back room, asking if she still loved him. She didn't reply. Her father had made it clear, this marriage isn't about love. It's about legacy. Dyke stood at the altar in a white caftan embroidered with gold, smiling like a king. No one could see the emptiness behind his eyes. No one knew what he had done, or who he had discarded just weeks ago. The applause drowned any guilt he might have felt. As they exchanged vows, Amaka lay in a market woman's house, curled in pain. Her host, Mom Nkechi, was a widow who had taken her in out of pity. "I saw the way you looked, my dear," she said. "No woman should cry like that alone." Amaka was grateful but silent. She had no voice left to tell her story. She cleaned the shop, helped fetch water, and did odd chores for passers-by, trying to scrape together savings for her antenatal visits. In her belly, the baby kicked for the first time. She touched her stomach and whispered, "It's okay. We will get through this." That same evening, fireworks lit up the sky above the Obioma estate. Dyke and Clara toasted to forever. The irony burned deeper than any flame. The city rejoiced in luxury, while the true heir to the Obioma fortune lay unborn in the belly of a girl no one remembered. As champagne bottles popped and political connections were sealed, no one knew that the legacy Dyke so desperately celebrated was already slipping through his fingers. The lie had been spoken into the microphone, the dance had begun, and society clapped. But far away in silence, a new life was waiting, a life born not of love, but of pain. And yet, it would be that very life that would rewrite everything. The days following the wedding were filled with interviews, business meetings, and endless congratulatory messages. Dyke, now officially married into one of the most powerful political families in Nigeria, had never felt more invincible. Clara played the role of the perfect wife in public, graceful, intelligent, and strategically distant, which Dyke mistook for elegance. On the surface, all was well. But beneath, their marriage was nothing more than a transaction, and Dyke knew it. He buried his discomfort in business. One morning, rushing from one meeting to another in Ikoyi, he barked into his phone, distracted by a call about a government contract delay. His driver swerved to avoid a reckless bus merging onto the highway, but the sudden jerk sent their SUV spiraling out of control. Metal met concrete. Glass exploded. Silence followed. When Dyke opened his eyes, everything hurt, his ribs, his spine, his pride. He was covered in blood, strapped to a stretcher, and surrounded by sirens. Clara, when informed, screamed on the phone, but never made it to the hospital until the cameras were set. The hospital's top surgeon stabilized him. The headlines the next day read, "Billionaire CEO narrowly escapes death." But something quiet happened during the internal scan. A small note in the bottom margin of his results mentioned trauma to his reproductive organs. The consulting physician, overwhelmed by Dyke's VIP status and other life-threatening issues, didn't highlight it. The file was signed off, sealed, and handed to his assistant. Dyke was too focused on getting back to work to look through the details himself. He returned home days later, with a neck brace, bruised pride, and the belief that he'd survived everything. But something had quietly died inside him, something no doctor had yet told him. As the mansion resumed normal life, Dyke was praised for his resilience. Clara was by his side in public, but spent most nights sleeping in the guest room. She rarely touched him, rarely asked about his health, beyond formalities. And though Dyke noticed her emotional distance, he didn't care enough to ask. He was still numb, from the accident, from the emptiness of the marriage, from the guilt he hadn't named. What he didn't know was that the one night he forced himself on Amaka had not only produced a child, but also marked the final time he would ever father one. And while he healed from the external wounds, the internal damage, the one that would rewrite his future, sat silently, waiting for the day it would finally be revealed. In a poorly lit government hospital in the heart of Ajagunal, Amaka lay on a rusted metal bed, gripping the sides as waves of labor pain racked through her small frame. Rain beat heavily against the corrugated roof. The midwife attending to her was overworked and underpaid, her uniform stained, her voice stern. "Push, girl. You think you're the only one who has carried shame," the woman barked. Amaka didn't respond. Her face was pale, her lips chapped, but her eyes burned with something fierce, a mother's will to endure. Hours later, with no pain relief, no comfort, and barely any equipment, a baby boy was born. His cry pierced the air like a trumpet. He was perfect, dark-skinned, round-cheeked, with eyes that mirrored the man who had rejected him. Amaka stared at him through a film of tears. She named him Chidura, meaning what God has written. She whispered the name over and over as if it were a prayer, a battle cry, a promise. She counted his fingers, kissed his forehead, and wrapped him in an old wrapper Mom and Ketchy had sewn for her from leftover cloth. Her body ached. Her soul still carried bruises, but her heart was full. In those first few hours, she forgot the pain, the betrayal, the memory of how she had been discarded like a broken thing. Chidura was her new beginning, the one person who would never doubt her worth. She held him close and promised him the world, even if the world had denied her everything. The days that followed were hard. She had no formal maternity leave, no family in Lagos, and no money. Yet every day she woke up, strapped Chidura to her back, and walked from one market stall to the next asking if they needed cleaning help or clothes mended. Eventually, she began sewing baby clothes for local mothers using a borrowed machine. Her hands bled from constant stitching, but her spirit remained unbroken. She bathed her son in a plastic basin, sang to him under flickering bulbs, and never complained. She watched his eyes open wider, his fingers clutch her thumb, his lips curl in sleep. He became her reason, not just to survive, but to rise. Though the world saw her as a maid-turned-single mother, she saw herself as a queen in the making. And in her arms, she held a prince the world would one day regret overlooking. While Amaka was struggling to breathe through hardship, the Obioma mansion was throwing yet another celebration. Clara was pregnant. Dyke, still recovering from the accident and under pressure from both families to produce an heir, was thrilled. The news was like morphine to his guilt. Clara made the announcement over dinner with a faint smile, her hand carefully resting on her still flat stomach. Dyke stood and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. The staff clapped. Wine was poured. All sins felt forgiven in that moment. But Clara's eyes didn't shine with joy. They shone with survival. She knew the truth. The child growing inside her wasn't Dyke's. It was Jide's, her ex-lover and Dyke's former protege. Jide was younger, charismatic, and once admired Dyke until he realized Dyke used people as ladders. When Clara, bored and emotionally abandoned, began meeting Jide in secret, she convinced herself it was just a distraction. But when she got pregnant and Dyke announced he was infertile, without even knowing it, her decision was simple. She would lie. Dyke's obsession with legacy made it easy. He didn't question the timeline. He wanted a son more than he wanted the truth. Jide, on the other hand, didn't stay quiet. He began texting Clara, "That's my son. You know it. I want in, or I'll tell him." Clara panicked. She paid him off once, But Jide wasn't finished. As Clara's belly grew, so did the secret between them. Dyke decorated the nursery, chose baby names, and began drafting new legal documents for inheritance. Obioma II, he called the baby. It was his redemption, a second chance after the shame of casting Amaka out. He even donated to orphanages and maternal health initiatives, believing fate had offered him balance. But beneath the surface, he was building a castle on sand. He didn't know that every joy he felt was rooted in betrayal. And while he kissed his wife's stomach and planned his empire's future, the real heir to everything he owned was growing up in a crowded room on the other side of the city, quiet, brilliant, and completely unknown. Life in Ajagunal was unforgiving, a labyrinth of rusted rooftops, narrow alleys, and the constant scent of survival. But in the heart of that chaos, Amaka carved out a corner of peace, one sacrifice at a time. Each morning, she woke before sunrise to pound laundry for neighbors. Chidura, now a curious 2-year-old, would sit on a mat behind her, watching with wide eyes as his mother worked. She carried him on her back to the open market, strapped him beside her at the sewing table, and taught him to say thank you before he could spell his own name. She sold custom-sewn wrappers to women who didn't ask questions and saved every naira she earned, not for herself, but for the day Chidura would walk into a classroom with dignity. She kept his clothes clean even when hers were threadbare. If she had just enough for a meal, it went to him. She lived on hope and hunger, and it was worth every bit of pain. As the years passed, Chidura began to show signs of something remarkable. He memorized market figures before he could count them. He'd listen to the radio and ask questions about words far beyond his age. He corrected adults when they used incorrect grammar and learned how to read by picking old newspapers Amaka used to wrap items. One afternoon, the owner of the local food kiosk where Amaka worked noticed Chidura reciting multiplication tables to himself. "This boy gets sense past him age," she muttered, handing Amaka a flyer for a free scholarship test at a government-backed academy. Amaka didn't think twice. She ironed Chidura's best shirt, polished his worn sandals, and walked him for over an hour to the school gates. The building was larger than anything he had seen. The security guard laughed when he saw them. "Ma, this one no fit compete here. The children inside na ministers and governors Pekin." But Amaka stood tall and said, "He'll try. That's all we ask." And try he did. Chidura took the test in silence, finishing long before the others. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived bearing the crest of the Obioma Foundation Academy, the very school funded by Dyke's company for underprivileged geniuses. He had not only passed, he had scored the highest mark in the entire region. Amaka cried for the first time in years, not out of sadness, but gratitude. She hugged her son and whispered, "Your name will open doors even if mine couldn't." She didn't know that the same hands who once destroyed her life were now unknowingly funding her son's rise. Destiny had begun to stir, quietly stitching threads between the boy who was denied and the empire he was born to inherit. Amaka continued sewing that night, her needle trembling as tears of silent victory fell onto the cloth. The world had laughed at her struggle, but her child was already writing a different ending. Back at the Obioma estate, tension had begun to seep into the air like humidity before storm. Clara, once confident and polished, had grown increasingly nervous. She was always on edge, checking her phone constantly, avoiding long conversations with Dyke, and making excuses to avoid any mention of Jide. Her husband's blindness to the signs gave her temporary comfort, but fear now gnawed at her in secret. Jide had stopped asking politely. His messages had become direct threats. "If you think I'll sit back while my son grows up with another man's name, think again," he wrote. Clara panicked, wired more hush money into his account, and then called her sister in Port Harcourt, crying, "He's going to ruin everything." She feared not just the scandal, but what Dyke would do if the truth ever surfaced. He was not a man known for mercy. Dyke, on the other hand, was preoccupied with expansion projects, new political partnerships, and maintaining the image of the perfect marriage. He didn't notice how Clara flinched when Jide's name came up in business meetings, or how she avoided certain dates when asked to plan family events. But even as he ignored her behavior, his instincts itched. Something didn't feel right. His staff whispered about odd phone calls. His assistant noticed Clara once delete a message quickly when Dyke entered the room. But Dyke dismissed it all. His focus remained on the boy he believed was his, Obioma too, now 3 years old, playful and affectionate. He loved the boy genuinely. He would watch him sleep and smile to himself, imagining all the legacy he would pass on. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that his entire foundation had been built on a lie. Meanwhile, Chidura's first term at Obioma Foundation Academy brought more surprises. The boy quickly rose to the top of his class, astonishing even the most seasoned teachers with his intellect, curiosity, and quiet discipline. The school director, during a quarterly board update, even mentioned him by name. "That boy from Ajagunal, Chidura, Amaka, is something else," he said, laughing. Dyke, who sat at the board table, barely reacted. The name didn't register. Too many children. Too many reports. But the seed had been planted. The quiet storm was gathering. Across the city, a boy was rising, bearing the very eyes and mind of the man who had once denied his existence. Fate had begun to circle, patient and precise. The truth was approaching, not with noise, but with the unshakable weight of destiny. It wasn't until Dyke was nominated for a potential federal advisory position that everything began to unravel. As part of the vetting process, he was required to undergo a full executive health screening, a formality he'd taken several times before. But this time, a new physician was assigned, one who insisted on being thorough. Days later, Dyke sat in his private clinic office reviewing a routine blood report when the doctor leaned forward and cleared his throat. "Mr. Obioma," he began, "have you ever had a discussion with a specialist about the trauma from your accident years ago?" Dyke blinked. "Not in detail." "Why?" The doctor turned the screen toward him. "You suffered a specific kind of internal damage, one that should have been flagged. I'm surprised no one caught it. Sir, you're infertile. You have been since that crash. Naturally, you can't father a child." The words hit like a punch. Dyke stared, unmoving. Infertile? His brain scrambled for logic. "But my son," he stammered. The doctor shook his head. "It's medically impossible, sir. I'm sorry." Silence enveloped the room. Dyke slowly stood, walked to the window, and stared blankly at the traffic below. His mind replayed the day Clara told him she was pregnant. The joy, the plans, the investments, the inheritance adjustments. He thought of his son's smile. Was it all a lie? His chest tightened. Betrayal crept in like venom. He didn't drive home that day. He sat in his car for hours, gripping the steering wheel, unable to breathe. When he finally reached the mansion, he went straight to his study and demanded a DNA test be arranged immediately, quietly, without Clara knowing. The results arrived days later. He opened the envelope with trembling hands. The words stared back at him like thunder. No biological relation detected. Dyke collapsed into his chair. The wall spun. His marriage a fraud. His son another man's child. His empire without an heir. He remembered Amaka's words. Her tears. Her trembling voice. "I'm pregnant, sir." Suddenly, everything made sense. He had discarded the only true heir he ever had. The weight of his mistake nearly crushed him. For the first time in his life, Dyke didn't feel powerful. He felt empty, cold, afraid. His entire legacy had been built on the ashes of his denial. And now, without warning, the ghosts of the past had returned, and they would not leave quietly. Clara knew something had changed. Dyke, once passionate in his pursuit of building a perfect legacy, now sat in silence most nights, barely speaking over dinner. His eyes, once filled with possessive pride when he looked at their son, now seemed distant, suspicious even. He had stopped calling the child Obioma II, referring to him only as the boy. Clara tried to ignore the tension, hoping it was one of his usual business moods, but she underestimated how much Dyke had uncovered. When the DNA result arrived and confirmed the child was not biologically his, Dyke didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he sat in his study for hours, staring at old photographs of his wedding, of the baby's naming ceremony, of him lifting a child into the air, smiling like a fool. Then the rage arrived, flooding his chest like fire. Not just rage at Clara, but at himself for being so blind, so foolish, and so dismissive of the one person who had told him the truth years ago, Amaka. The confrontation came like a storm. He waited for Clara to walk into the bedroom, then tossed the DNA result onto the bed. "Whose child is it?" he asked coldly. Clara froze, her soul abandoning her feet. "Dyke, please let me expla," she began, but he raised a hand and repeated the question louder. "Whose child is it?" She broke down. Through tears, stammering confessions, and trembling hands, she admitted everything. The affair with Jide, the manipulation, the desperation to survive a marriage that had become a prison. Dyke didn't flinch. He let her talk, but in his silence was the sharpest blade. "Get out," he finally said. "Tonight." Clara begged, tried to cling to the only life she had known. But Dyke was done. The guards were called. Her clothes were thrown into suitcases. The boy cried, confused. But Dyke didn't look back. That night, the mansion, grand and gilded, became colder than ever. The lie had been buried, but its consequences had only begun to rise. By morning, the media caught wind of something brewing. Clara's absence from events was noticed. Jide's social media posts grew bolder, cryptic captions, half-revealed photos, and passive-aggressive taunts. Rumors began swirling that the Obioma marriage was a fraud. Dyke's team scrambled to control the narrative, but he had already retreated into himself. He stopped going to the office. He canceled meetings. He disconnected from everything. His assistants didn't dare ask questions. The man who once ruled empires with a glare now sat in his study, haunted by echoes of the past. And a single name kept returning to him like a thunderclap in the rain. Amaka. The woman he had thrown out. The woman who told the truth. The woman who might have given him the only legacy he truly had left. The event was small, a scholarship recognition ceremony organized by the Obioma Foundation, aimed at honoring high-performing students from underprivileged backgrounds. Dyke hadn't planned to attend. In fact, he hadn't left the house in days. But something in him, perhaps guilt, perhaps desperation, made him show up unannounced, dressed in simple native wear, without the usual convoy or media buzz. He arrived as the keynote speech was ending, sitting quietly in the back row, away from the crowd. His name was whispered, his presence noted, but no one dared disturb him. His eyes, however, scanned the stage absent-mindedly until they fell upon the final recipient stepping forward, a young boy, 11 or 12, with piercing eyes and a calm but focused demeanor. The host announced his name, Chidura Amaka. The sound of that name struck Dyke like a blow to the chest. Chidura Amaka. The boy stepped forward in a well-ironed school uniform, his speech paper in hand. As he approached the podium, Dyke's heartbeat quickened. He stared. The nose, the jawline, the way he stood, without fear, it was like staring at a younger version of himself. The resemblance was undeniable. Then the boy spoke. His voice was clear, intelligent, and deeply respectful. "My name is Chidura Amaka. I want to thank the Obioma Foundation for believing in children like me, children who were not born with opportunities, but who are determined to rise." The room applauded, but Dyke didn't move. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. His mouth went dry. In that moment, time collapsed. He remembered the stormy night, the denial, the shame, the rejection. And now, right before him, stood the echo of everything he had tried to bury. After the event, Dyke requested the scholarship records. His assistant hesitated. It was unusual, but complied. When Dyke saw the file and read the name, mother's name, Amaka Ease, he nearly dropped the folder. There was no more room for doubt. His chest tightened with a mix of awe and despair. He had found his son, or rather, his son had found success despite him. Dyke ordered a quiet DNA test, taken without the boy's knowledge, through a handshake and a napkin. Within 72 hours, the result was back. 99.9% match. Biological father confirmed. Dyke read the report in silence, then laid it flat on his desk and lowered his head into his hands. The child he had denied, the legacy he had thrown away, the truth he had insulted, was the only truth left standing. He had found his son. But what remained now was whether that son would ever want to find him. It was supposed to bring relief, clarity, at least. But when Dyke stared at the result confirming Chidura as his son, he felt no peace. Instead, it awakened a sorrow he couldn't name. He remembered the night he forced Amaka out, the way her eyes pleaded with him not for pity, but for truth. He remembered the things he said, "Go give that bastard to whoever it belongs to." And now, nearly 12 years later, the truth stood unshakable, holding a trophy on a stage built by the very foundation that had once cast his mother aside. Dyke paced the room like a man possessed, his mind darting between rage and regret. He wanted to run to Amaka, to apologize, to beg. But how does one apologize for years of absence? How do you knock on a door you once slammed shut with your foot? Eventually, he gathered himself and told his assistant to find Amaka's address. Quietly. No public spectacle. No media spin. When he finally stood outside the modest flat in Ajagunal where she lived, his heart pounded louder than any boardroom negotiation he'd ever faced. He knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she stood, older, wiser, but still beautiful in a way that came from struggle and survival. She didn't scream. She didn't slam the door. She simply stared at him. "Amaka," he whispered. Her arms were folded. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice even. Dyke's eyes welled. "I came to say, I know the truth now. I know he's mine, and I know I was wrong." Silence. Then Amaka shook her head slowly and said the words that made him sink. "But knowing now doesn't change what you did then." Inside, Chidura was reading a science textbook. He didn't know his father was at the door. He didn't know the man who threw his mother out was now begging to be let in. Dyke wanted to see him, talk to him, hold him. But Amaka blocked the path, not with hate, but with dignity. She didn't insult him. She didn't spit on him. She simply said, "You left when we needed you most. We're not the same people anymore. He's growing just fine without you." Dyke nodded, defeated. As he turned to leave, Amaka said one more thing, "You can try. But don't expect him to be like you." And with that, the door closed gently, not in anger, but with finality. Outside, Dyke stood in the dusk, unsure if he had just found his future, or lost it again. Dyke returned to his mansion that evening not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man confronted with the wreckage of his past. The long hallways, the marble stairs, the gold-etched mirrors, all felt cold now, like monuments to a lie. He walked into his study and stared at the wall of awards, plaques, and framed newspaper covers that once made him proud. But none of them could silence the echo of Amaka's voice. "We're not the same people anymore." That sentence rang like a sentence, the kind given to men who destroy and pretend they can rebuild with mere apology. For the first time in his life, Dyke wished he could exchange all his power for one honest moment with his son. But the price of truth is time, and time had passed him by. He had built his empire on the illusion that legacy was about control. But legacy, he now realized, was about memory. And Amaka remembered everything. Unable to sleep, Dyke drafted a letter to Amaka. He wrote with trembling hands, pouring out not just regret, but acknowledgement. He confessed everything. How he let pride drive his actions, how he believed her pregnancy was a trap, and how it was easier to protect his image than confront his conscience. He told her he wasn't seeking redemption, just a second chance to know his son. He begged her not as a billionaire, but as a man who had lost too much already. He folded the letter, sealed it, and sent it to her address the next morning through his most trusted assistant. But no reply came. Days passed, then a week, then two. Still nothing. Dyke couldn't force his way back into their lives, not this time. And so he began doing the only thing left. He showed up at Chidura's school during debate tournaments, sat quietly in the back during chess competitions, and clapped during award ceremonies from the shadows. He never approached, never disrupted. He watched, slowly letting his presence become part of the background, hoping the boy might one day turn and see something more than the man who had disappeared. Amaka, meanwhile, noticed. She saw the expensive car that parked 2 streets away. She saw the man in dark glasses quietly slipping into the last row at school events. And though part of her was angry, another part softened. Not because she forgave him, but because she saw the sincerity in his silence. She didn't tell Chidura that his father had found him. She didn't want to poison his view or force reconciliation. Instead, she chose to let time do what pride never could. In the evenings, she'd watch her son from the kitchen window as he read or practiced his speeches. She knew a storm had passed and another was coming. But for now, she was proud. Proud that despite everything, she had raised a boy who didn't need a powerful name to shine. Yet still, deep inside, she wondered, could a boy raised on abandonment ever accept a father who returned too late? By the time Chidura turned 13, he had already become a name among the elite students of Lagos. His face appeared in local newspapers as the Ajagunal prodigy, a scholarship student outperforming children of senators and CEOs. But behind his brilliance was a wall, high, thick, and cold. He had grown up knowing his father was gone, but never knowing the details. Whenever he asked Amaka, she would pause, choose her words, and say, "He wasn't ready for us." As a child, Chidura accepted that. As a teenager, it brewed into resentment. In his journal, he often wrote letters he never sent, to the man who never came, or, "You should have seen the day I won my first award. But you weren't there." His brilliance became his armor. He told himself he didn't need anyone, especially a man who didn't even fight to stay. When Chidura finally caught Dyke watching one of his debates from the back of the auditorium, his chest burned. The man who once refused to claim him now sat in a fine suit, clapping like a stranger. After the event, Dyke approached him gently, hands behind his back like he was approaching a wild animal. "Chidura," he said softly. The boy froze, then turned. "Yes, sir?" His voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. I'm proud of you," Dyke said. Chidura stared at him. "Are you?" he replied. "Funny. You weren't proud when you kicked my mother out." The words hit like bullets. Dyke's face paled. He tried to speak, but Chidura walked past him, adding, "Your pride came too late." Amaka, standing a few feet away, said nothing. She had known this moment would come, and that her son, though polite, was no longer interested in repair. In the following weeks, Dyke tried again. He sent gifts, books, a custom laptop, handwritten notes. Chidura returned each one, not out of malice, but principle. "I earned my way here," he told his mother. "I don't need his pity now." Amaka sat him down one night. "He's trying," she said gently. Chidura shrugged. "He should have tried before. When we were sleeping on floors. When you were sick. When you had no food. Now he wants to show up because I've become someone." His voice cracked slightly, revealing the wound beneath the steel. Amaka placed her hand on his. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm just asking you to listen, when you're ready." But Chidura wasn't ready. Not yet. Not when the scars were still fresh. Dyke, in all his wealth and remorse, had returned to a son who no longer looked at him with longing, but with resolve. And that was a pain money could never fix. While Dyke grappled with regret and Chidura built his wall higher, the other storm finally broke, and it came for Clara. Jide, tired of being silenced and insulted, made good on his threat. He leaked private messages, photographs, and voice notes to a popular online journalist, evidence of the affair, the deception, and the truth behind Obioma 2. Within hours, the story went viral. "Billionaire's marriage built on lies. DNA scandal rocks Obioma empire," read the headlines. Clara's image, once untouchable, was dragged through the mud. Her father, Senator Namani, held a press conference disowning her, saying her choices have embarrassed the family and destroyed a powerful alliance. Clara tried to call Dyke. He didn't answer. She sent emails. They went unread. Her cards were blocked. Her properties were quietly repossessed. And for the first time in her privileged life, Clara stood alone, not as a senator's daughter or a billionaire's wife, but as a woman with nothing left to hide behind. Social media mocked her, newspapers dissected her downfall, and even former friends distanced themselves. She tried to issue a public apology, but it was too late. The world had already made up its mind. Jide, ever opportunistic, used the attention to boost his own company, even going on talk shows to clarify his side. Clara was left humiliated, jobless, and evicted from the same mansion where she once hosted champagne parties. She stayed briefly with her cousin, then quietly relocated to Enugu to avoid the backlash. Dyke never uttered her name again. In his mind, she was part of the cost, not just a betrayal, but of forgetting what mattered most. Legacy wasn't forged through powerful connections or curated appearances. It was built on truth. And Clara had built theirs on quicksand. Ironically, it was Amaka who learned of Clara's downfall from the news. She watched the press conference replay on her tiny television and sighed. "The storm always comes," she whispered. She felt no joy in Clara's disgrace, only the heavy reality that power doesn't protect anyone from consequences. Later that evening, Chidura asked, "Was she the woman he married after you?" Amaka nodded. "She wasn't the enemy, Chidura. Your father was the one who left." The boy nodded, not to agree, but to process. That night, as Lagos buzzed with gossip and the media ripped apart a fallen queen, Dyke sat alone in his study, watching the footage on mute. He didn't smile. He didn't rage. He simply turned off the screen and whispered to himself, "I built all this for a lie." The fallout from the Clara scandal didn't just damage reputations. It shook the very foundations of Obioma Holdings. Investors began to grow nervous. The media frenzy, paired with whispers of paternity fraud and silent power struggles within the company, ignited boardroom fires. For the first time in a decade, shareholders called an emergency vote. Rumors swirled about who would succeed Dyke as chairman. The man once considered untouchable was now seen as vulnerable, wounded by scandal, isolated by personal mistakes, and without a confirmed heir. Dyke walked into the boardroom that day in a dark gray suit, slower than usual, quieter than usual. But there was something simmering beneath his silence, something sharp, calculated, and unexpected. As the meeting opened, one board member boldly asked, "Mr. Obioma, in light of recent revelations, who is your named successor?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Dyke stood, walked to the head of the table, and with a calm voice replied, "There is one. But you haven't met him yet." Gasps rippled through the room. Another voice, skeptical, asked, "Sir, are you referring to the scholarship boy in the news?" Dyke nodded. "Yes. His name is Chidura Amaka. He is my biological son." The room went still. Then whispers began, suspicion, disbelief, and murmurs about image risks. Dyke raised a hand. "I once denied him. I once denied his mother. That was the greatest mistake of my life. But if we're talking legacy, if we're talking about who should lead the future of this empire, he is the only one qualified to do so." He paused, then added, "He has no interest in money, only in truth. And that's the kind of leader we need." The press conference followed an hour later. Dyke stood before dozens of cameras and journalists, his face weary but honest. "Today," he began, "I correct a long-standing lie. The boy the world saw at the Foundation's scholarship ceremony, Chidura, is my son. Years ago, I threw away the truth because I thought I could replace it with comfort. I was wrong. Legacy isn't built on perfection. It's built on courage to face your past." Amaka, watching from her home, was stunned. She hadn't expected him to go public. Neither had Chidura. But in that moment, something shifted. The media, the board, the public, everyone turned to look at the boy they once dismissed as a street child. And suddenly, he became the face of something bigger than wealth. Dyke had reclaimed his son, not through a will or wealth, but through truth. And though the damage wasn't undone, the cracks had been exposed to light. In the days following the press conference, the entire country buzzed with one name, Chidura Amaka. Headlines shifted from scandal to surprise. Journalists sought interviews. News segments analyzed his public speech recordings. Social media exploded with posts comparing his achievements to children raised in privilege. But through it all, one quiet figure stood taller than all the noise, Amaka. The world suddenly wanted to know, who was the woman who raised a boy like Chidura? Interviews were requested, profiles proposed, donations offered. But Amaka, consistent in her silence, declined them all. When approached, she simply said, "I didn't raise him for the world. I raised him because I refused to let pain define us." Her grace silenced every critic. Her strength became a national example. For the first time in her life, the world didn't see her as a maid. They saw her as a woman who had turned humiliation into strength and shame into power. The board of Obioma Holdings, previously divided, now began to shift. With public opinion on Chidura's side and Dyke's brave confession garnering reluctant admiration, members who once doubted now leaned toward transition. But Amaka made one thing clear: Chidura's future would not be dictated by power or greed. When Dyke offered her a formal executive seat in the Obioma Foundation, she accepted on one condition: let it serve the ones like us, the ones you once ignored. Dyke agreed. Amaka brought in new school programs, redirected funding toward forgotten communities, and opened doors for children who would have once been dismissed at the gate. Her quiet redemption wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't wear diamonds or host galas. She wore Ankara, walked with calm, and spoke only when needed. And yet, the power in her footsteps made the ground tremble. At one board dinner, one of the newer investors asked, "Who is that woman?" Dyke, seated across from Amaka, replied softly, "That's the mother of everything I nearly lost." He didn't look at her as a servant anymore. He looked at her as the one who stood tall when he crumbled. She had no degree, no titles, but she carried wisdom in every word. He respected her, not out of guilt anymore, but out of reverence. Meanwhile, Chidura continued excelling at school, turning down sponsorship deals and refusing all public appearances. When asked why, he replied, "I don't want fame. I want focus. My mother taught me that." And in that, he honored her more than any award could. Redemption had not come through revenge, but through dignity. And Amaka, once thrown into the streets, now stood at the table not as a guest, but as the standard. Despite all the progress, Dyke still felt the unhealed wound: Chidura's silence. The boy who had once been a distant shadow was now a national figure, but he still wouldn't speak more than a few cold words to him. "He's polite," Dyke once told his therapist, "but not warm." And it haunted him. The public apology had shifted perception, yes, but it hadn't repaired the damage between father and son. Amaka, wise and protective, gave Dyke space. "He'll come around when he's ready," she'd say. But Dyke feared time might harden the wall even further. So he did the only thing he knew how to do when words failed him. He wrote a letter. Late one night, sitting in the same study where he had once thrown Amaka's name away like garbage, Dyke took pen to paper, and this time he wrote with his soul. The letter wasn't filled with just regret. It was filled with stories of his own broken childhood, of how fear made him cruel, and how arrogance made him blind. He spoke of the day he first saw Chidura on stage and felt his bones shake. He admitted that he had used money as a wall and power as a mask. "But when I saw you speak," he wrote, "I didn't see a son I had missed. I saw a man I could never be." He ended with the words, "I don't want to own you. I don't want to control you. I only want the chance to be worthy of hearing you call me father, even just once." The next morning, he sent it by hand to Amaka, with a note, "Only if he asks. Not before." Amaka held the letter for 2 days, unsure. Then finally, she gave it to Chidura. He didn't open it right away. He stared at it for hours. That night, he sat on the roof of their flat, the city lights blinking below him. He read every word. And by the time he finished, tears, ones he hadn't let fall in years, rolled down his face. He didn't rush to reply. He didn't run into Dyke's arms. But the next morning, he folded the letter back into its envelope, placed it under his pillow, and looked at his mother. "He still lost time," he whispered. "But maybe he doesn't have to lose everything." That was all he said. Amaka smiled faintly. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. But it was the beginning. The seed had been planted, not of reconciliation, but of reckoning. And sometimes that's all a broken man could ask for. Weeks passed. The city began to quiet down. The media shifted its gaze elsewhere. But inside Dyke's heart, the war still raged. He had done everything. Confessed publicly, faced disgrace, given up pride. But the one thing he wanted the most, a relationship with his son, still evaded him. Then one evening, he received a call from Amaka. Her voice was calm, but firm. "Chidura wants to speak with you. Just the two of you." Dyke's heart pounded. He didn't ask questions. He drove himself to the quiet garden behind the Obioma Foundation headquarters, where Chidura now interned during school breaks. The sun was setting when Dyke arrived. Chidura sat on a bench, his arms folded, watching koi fish glide through a shallow pond. "Thank you for coming," the boy said without looking up. Dyke stood still, afraid to ruin the moment. Then Chidura turned to him, eyes piercing. "I read your letter." Dyke nodded. "And?" he asked. The boy took a deep breath. It was honest. "That's rare for people like you." Dyke opened his mouth to respond, but Chidura raised a hand. "But don't think that makes us even. You had years to be my father. Years to carry me when I was sick, to celebrate my wins, to comfort my mother. You chose power instead." Dyke swallowed the lump rising in his throat. Then Chidura stood up. "I'm not here for healing. I'm here to make something clear." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't own me. You can't buy me. And if you ever try to control what I become, I will take everything you built. Not out of anger, but because I can." The words hung like judgment in the air. Dyke didn't speak. He couldn't. Chidura stepped back, adjusted his backpack, and added one final blow. "You built your legacy by stepping on people like my mother. Now I'm the legacy you didn't plan for, and I'll be the one to rewrite your name." He walked away, calm but thunderous. Dyke remained frozen by the pond, breathing hard. He had expected anger, even tears. But not this, a controlled threat from a boy he had once dismissed as disposable. In that moment, Dyke understood the depth of his failure. He hadn't just lost his son's love. He had created a new force, one sharper, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than regret. And for once, he didn't feel like a father. He felt like a man standing at the mercy of his own mistakes. 5 years later, Chidura Obioma stood at a podium inside the newly renamed Amaka Innovation Center, the flagship youth empowerment hub of Obioma Holdings. He was now 21, a graduate of one of the most prestigious tech institutes in Africa, founder of a startup transforming educational access, and recently announced as the youngest incoming non-executive board member of Obioma Holdings. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled. But Chidura's eyes were on only one person, his mother. Seated in the front row, Amaka wore a simple blue Ankara dress, her hands folded on her lap, her expression proud but quiet. She didn't need applause. She was the reason everything existed. Dyke sat farther back in the audience. His beard had grayed. His steps were slower. He had officially stepped down from CEO duties a year prior, citing new leadership and a future built by youth. Since then, he had retreated from the public eye. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't even sad. He was reflective. He watched his son, his blood, his proof, take the stage, and knew the empire was in better hands now. In private, Dyke had apologized many times. Not with gifts. Not with grand speeches. Just with presence. Silent presence. At birthdays. At doctor's appointments. At school exhibitions. Chidura hadn't called him Dad yet. But he no longer turned away either. And in Dyke's old age, that was enough. As the ceremony ended, Chidura walked off stage and came to where his mother sat. He helped her up, wrapped one arm around her shoulder, and led her toward the exit. The crowd parted. Even the board members, who once dismissed her, now stood in respect. She passed Dyke without stopping, but her head tilted slightly. A nod. He nodded back. That was their new rhythm. Respect without revision. Chidura paused, glanced back at his father, then gave a small, unreadable smile. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but something. Maybe acknowledgement. Then he turned forward again, walking beside the woman who had given him everything. The world watched as a new legacy took its first true steps, not born of power, but of pain turned into purpose. Years later, a biography would be written about the Obioma Empire. But it wouldn't begin with Dyke's fortune. It wouldn't start in the boardroom or the mansion. It would begin in a market flat in Ajagunal, with a line that read, "She was once a maid. He was once a mistake. Together they built the future." Inside its pages, there were stories of betrayal, of denial, of dignity rising from dust. And at its heart, it told the story of a woman named Amaka, who had nothing but courage, and a boy named Chidura, who made the world remember her name. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.